can say start from fresh or continue from the last session. Mike?
I think there is definitely a continuation, Jason, and I've organized my talk to try and make it a continuation.
Okay.
Let me suggest how. First of all, Larry was talking about the relationship between systems thinking and cybernetics, and potentially the need for a closer collaboration between them. But as I made a point clear last week, I do think that many cyberneticians' appreciation of systems thinking tended to stop in the 1960s, and they haven't perhaps looked at some of the later developments in systems thinking. So I want to go through my sort of history of systems thinking as I see it. And as I said, just in our introductory chat, I will do that in terms of systems thinking, which I know best. I don't deign to tell cyberneticians about the history of their transdiscipline cybernetics, but I'll outline the history of systems thinking in a way that I hope allows cyberneticians to relate to it and to see different developments in cybernetics related to different developments in systems thinking. And as part of that, and relating to Klaus's notion of a critical cybernetics, I'll look particularly at critical developments in systems thinking, critical systems thinking. Is that okay? So it relates to both the talks last week.
Of course.
I believe.
Of course.
Okay, here we go. So it's my history of systems thinking, but done in a way that will open it up to cybernetics and the history of cybernetics, overlaps, and therefore things that we can learn from that history and build on from that history, and coming on to critical cybernetics and the development of critical systems thinking. So we'll all have our view of the origins of systems thinking and cybernetics, as far back as Aristotle and Plato, and through the various Western and Eastern, indeed, philosophers. But increasingly, there's a lot of interest in the work of Alexander Bogdanov, a Russian systems thinker, who was writing in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He was a compatriot of Lenin's. He was a leader of the Bolshevik Party until he fell out with Lenin. And thereafter, he disagreed with Lenin on almost everything in terms of the way to develop socialism. But Bogdanov, many of you will know, came up with this idea of a universal science, which he called techtology, he called it techtology, a universal science. And you can see the origins of systems thinking, von Boers-Lamphis systems thinking, and you can see the origins of cybernetics, Wiener's cybernetics, in Bogdanov. Both are anticipated there. In particular, in relation to cybernetics, he has the notion of a bi-regulator, which is a negative feedback mechanism which maintains systems, societies, social systems in equilibrium. So I'm glad to see, and this is partially because of the translation recently of some of his work in English that's not been available before, that he's come to the fore as a potential founding father of both systems thinking and cybernetics. And if we want to look at how the two traditions relate to one another, it's no bad thing to go back to Bogdanov. In terms of then systems thinking, probably two main origin stories. One of systems engineering, which began in the Bell telephone laboratories when people started to talk about engineering not just components, but systems of components, and the extra difficulties concerned with that. And from that, we got the birth of the practical discipline of systems engineering, which is still extremely influential in areas such as project management, for example. And the other practical wing of systems thinking was systems analysis, which emerged from the RAND Corporation and military operations planning. Another of those multidisciplinary, if you like, transdisciplinary areas of work which occurred during, was born during and after the Second World War. Very important then, and soon thereafter, and of course Wiener was involved in wartime operations, so was Forrester, I think. So that they were sort of practical beginnings of systems thinking that led to systems engineering and systems analysis. And then in the more theoretical realm was the work of von Bertalanffy, and that of course came from biology. And there was a long tradition of organismic biology with Smuts and Vuccia and other people leading up to von Bertalanffy clarifying his notion of the open system and later his general system theory, GST. And he founded the Society for General Systems Research with Gerard and Boulding and Miller and Rappaport. I think were the main people involved at the beginning of that. I think that some of the discussion last week was a bit unfair to von Bertalanffy. He was a biologist, but he did think, as his general system theory suggests, way beyond biology, and he was influential in psychology as well. The notion of the self, if you like, as an open system, which had autonomy. And so you couldn't just explain human behavior in terms of stimulus and response. There was an autonomy to the self, and the self determined what happened in relation to in relation to stimuli. And there's much of Maturana and Varela there in von Bertalanffy, perhaps more than is given credit for when these things are written about. There's a bit of a split in general system theory, which becomes extremely important later in the history of systems thinking. A number of the early general system theorists, Miller, James Miller, Jim Miller, who founded the journal that I edited, and then Amanda Gregory's now editing, Behavioral Science, now Systems Research and Behavioral Science. He looked for general system laws at all levels of organization, if you like. But Boulding, in his hierarchy of complexity, said that we had to develop laws which were appropriate to the level of complexity with which we were dealing. And therefore, although laws at level 3 of Boulding's hierarchy, where he placed cybernetics, would still have an impact at level 4, where you get organisms, and level 6, I think it is, where you get people. There are emergent properties at those levels, which means that you need other laws as well, other ways of understanding what's happening at those levels. And this speaks to what Klaus has just been addressing, that you can't simply use models drawn from levels 3 and levels 4 of Boulding's hierarchy to understand what's going on at level 7 and level 8, higher levels of complexity. Anyway, those things were probably the founding basics of systems thinking, and they were practiced in systems engineering and systems analysis. They grew and they took on board new ideas. They took on cybernetic ideas. They took on some general system ideas, but they were basically based upon mechanical models. There was in the UK, particularly, although then developed internationally, socio-technical systems thinking, the work of Emery and Trist. And they began with mechanical models, but they soon moved on to organismic models to explain what was happening in their consultancies, and drew upon von Bertalanffy and the findings of general system theory. System dynamics, I think, is a bit of an odd one. Clearly, in many ways, lies closer to cybernetics. Larry would be able to tell us how close Forrester got to the original cyberneticians. I don't know to what extent he was involved, if at all, in the Macy conferences, but the notion of feedback, feed-forward loops that goes into system dynamics clearly has close relationships to cybernetics. But it's now, probably after systems engineering, the largest community that takes a systems or cybernetic approach. And the orientation of this kind of systems thinking, called by, for example, Jekyll and Hard systems thinking, is like that of first order cybernetics, I would argue. It's objectivist. It believes you can gain knowledge about the nature of reality and the way it works. It's functionalist. It hopes to try and improve the way that systems operate using, taking advantage of mechanistic and organismic analogies and models. Its purpose is to improve control. And in many ways, it's the extension of the existing scientific method to purposive systems. It makes the notion of brings the notion of teleology and achieving purposes. It brings that within the realm of science. So I see very close parallels between this form of systems thinking, systems engineering analysis, and first order cybernetics. Now, once the difficulties arose when systems engineering and systems analysis were applied to social systems. Again, in the way that Klaus indicated, you could get into some real big problems doing that. The systems analysis, systems engineering was so successful in the aerospace industry and in space engineering, for example, in the NASA programs to put a man on the moon, that they became incredibly popular in the United States. President Johnson and Secretary of State McNamara wanted them adopted throughout the federal government and in state governments. And of course, McNamara, with a version of systems analysis, used the approach to try and decide whether America was winning the Vietnam War or not, reducing the complexity of that problem to the counting of body bags. But what happened when these approaches were used and this is very well documented by Ida Hoos, looking at the experiments conducted by Governor Brown in California, is that they were immense failures when you tried to use systems engineering, systems analysis for social problems of, for example, transportation, waste, and crime. And Hoos documents what goes wrong. You need a very clear goal before you can start your systems engineering. And in crime, for example, that was one of crime prevention in a very narrow reductionist sense. And the outcomes were more toys for the boys, helicopters and riot control devices, rather than actually looking for the causes of crime. Transportation as a socio-technical system was viewed without consideration of the environment. Waste and plans for waste management were drawn up on the basis of a very few interviews. The thing was disastrous. And for a long time, systems thinking had a very damaged reputation as a result of those experiments in California. There were, however, other systems thinkers who were taking systems thinking in a different direction, based upon perhaps Boulding's notion of the image. And the image is the idea we have in our mind, which shapes the way that we see reality and the way, therefore, that we act in the world. This was his idea that once you get to the human level and the sociocultural level, then you have to pay attention to human intentions and meaning and their image of the world, the way they see the world, and therefore, based upon that, the way they act in the world. And a similar notion in the UK, and Vickers, Geoffrey Vickers drew his notions from Boulding, his idea of an appreciative system, the sort of network of values and facts that we have in our heads and through which we view the world. These were very powerful notions and took systems ideas in a more subjectivist direction. And you have thinkers such as Churchman and Akoff already building upon the traditions of American pragmatism, who started to develop softer systems approaches. And in the UK, you had Checkland, who didn't know about pragmatism, but began to base his work, derived from Vickers' thinking, upon Husserl's phenomenology and Dilthey's hermeneutics. And so the practice became radically different. Churchman's social systems design, for example, in his book, The Systems Approach, written in 1970, 71, I think, and even before that in Challenge to Reason, written in 1968. So about the time that von Forster was developing his ideas of second-order cybernetics, Churchman was declaring that the systems approach begins when first you see the world through the eyes of another. And this becomes the bringing together of alternative perspectives on the world, in Churchman's terms, through the process of dialectical debate. In Akoff's terms, through the building of an idealized design, which people can seek to approximate in practice. And in Checkland's soft systems methodology, through the development of conceptual models which make explicit particular worldviews, which people can then see for themselves, and they can see the Weltanschauungen underlying particular worldviews. They can understand other people's perspectives, and then can hopefully come to some kind of accommodations through conversation, which will allow action to be taken. A radically different tradition of systems thinking, therefore, developed soft systems thinking, and its orientation, I would argue, is very similar to that of second order cybernetics. It's much more subjectivist, it's interpretive, it looks at the way the observer observes the world, everything said is said by an observer. It seeks mutual understanding, and it differs from the traditional scientific method in that its chosen approach to doing work, to improving things, undertaking practice, is through action research, and a particular type of action research where you undertake change programs and are fully involved in those programs and view the results of the change and seek to learn from the results of the change. I know that dates back to Lewin's work and was also the foremost part of socio-technical systems thinking. But all of Churchman, Akoff and Checkland instituted action research programs. The next, so we could probably put that work in late 70s, early 80s, this new development in systems thinking. lot of Churchman's work, 68, 70, so a bit earlier than that. Design of Inquiring Systems, his major philosophical text, was about 5 different ways of gaining knowledge, looking back at philosophy. Akoff was writing throughout the 70s and 80s when he broke from OR. Checklin broke from systems engineering. His book, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice, was 1981. Here's a third strand in systems thinking, which probably came to the fore with the publication of a book by Werner Ulrich in 1983 called Critical Systems Heuristics, so he outlined an approach called Critical Systems Heuristics. And here we start to get some of the links with what Klaus referred to as critical cybernetics. The background theory here with emancipatory systems thinking is the work of Kant, looking at the assumptions that go into any kind of knowledge claims, but particularly understood through Habermas. Now, the critique of soft systems thinking, which Habermas allowed people to articulate, was that soft systems thinking, the debates and the discussions which were organized in soft systems approaches, could still be subject to power relationships, so that the outcome of such debates was not the force of the better argument, but was who held most power or who had most influence in the situation. Habermas set out an ideal, or the ideal speech situation, which was the conditions that any kind of dialogue or conversation would need in order for the outcome to be fair and equal and based upon the better argument rather than on power relationships. And Ulrich referred to that. Although he didn't believe that such an ideal was actually capable of being brought about in the real world. All we could do, Ulrich said, was with Churchman understand that the systems approach was always partial in its understanding of reality, and seek to reveal the partiality of any attempt to do systems thinking and any system designs that emerged from systems thinking. So his critical systems heuristics was about revealing and challenging the boundary judgments built into any particular systems design to try and see who they benefited and who perhaps they disadvantaged. And Gerald Midgley has taken that forward in his systemic intervention, looking at how groups can become marginalized, missed out of account in systems thinking and systems designs, if the boundaries exclude them and their concerns. Now, I think this very much links with what Klaus was saying about critical cybernetics, because Ulrich is insistent that systems designers be self-reflective about their designs, to have a look at which clients are benefiting and who's not benefiting. And he also wants to bring those designs into the discussion with the affected, those people who are affected by the designs, but not directly involved in the designing. And he has a means called the polemical employment of boundary judgments, whereby those who are not involved, the affected but not involved, can have their voices heard, and they can be brought onto an equal footing in terms of articulating their concerns with those who are actually involved in the process of the design. Now, this form of emancipatory systems thinking is largely subjectivist. It doesn't look closely into the social conditions which may actually give rise to some people having more power than others. But it's radical, it's challenging of systems designs. It's self-reflexive in that it asks systems designers to take account of the assumptions, the boundary judgments they're building into their designs, It's dialogical, it's based upon discussion. It involves the affected, seeks to involve the affected in any programs or projects of system design, and it's based upon action research. And this is the final significant slide of this presentation, Jason. Critical systems thinking, which you could call the whole school, which got started probably about 1984, with myself and Paul Keyes and Bob Flood, kept on with Joel Midgley, Amanda Gregory, and many others who've been through Hull and studied at Hull at their time. Now, critical systems thinking seeks to draw out the strengths and the weaknesses of previous systems traditions. So if you like, it tries to reconceptualize systems thinking as a whole. It's not trying to go back to the notion that we can understand the whole system, but it's trying to look at what the different systems of traditions of systems thinking have and can contribute to systems thinking and to the understanding of complexity. Its theoretical resources are the Frankfurt School of Sociology, who certainly saw value in the scientific objectivist approach, as long as it didn't extend into other domains. They were very worried about the kind of thinking that was prevalent in science being used and transferred to the social domain to effect greater prediction and control there. It's based upon the work of Habermas and particularly his knowledge constitutive interests. Habermas argued that the human species has three knowledge constitutive interests: in technical control of the natural environment, productivity, in well-being through increasing GDP, if you like, but that shouldn't dominate at the expense of another constitutive interest in mutual understanding. We have to make decisions and decide how we go forward, how we use technology, how we develop our societies. And there's a third knowledge constitutive interest in emancipation, which is about ensuring that everybody has a say in the way that the human species moves forward. Now, those three knowledge constitutive interests in Habermas correspond to hard, soft, and emancipatory systems thinking, and critical systems thinking tries to bring them together to address them all. It adheres to Churchman's notion that we can't understand the whole system. All attempts to understand the whole system are partial, and we need to reflect upon the partiality of our attempts to understand the whole system. Moran says much the same. Pepper says that nevertheless there are some extremely useful ways of understanding systems which have developed and humans have evolved over their history as a species. And we do draw upon mechanistic analogies and organismic analogies and contextualist analogies and formist analogies, he says, world hypotheses which have proved useful to us and which we shouldn't neglect easily. And Luhmann points to, in critical system thinking, the need to look at existing systems approaches from a second order perspective. In other words, how are they observing the world and what distinctions are they making? And what are they seeing and what are they not seeing? And on the basis of that theory, you can develop critical systems thinking and critical systems practice as a multi-perspectival examination of problem situations. We can look at problem situations through a variety of perspectives, through a variety of lenses, using different world hypotheses to try and tease out key aspects of complexity without ever believing that we'll understand the whole system. On that basis, and with a second order understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of different systems approaches, whether they be hard or soft or emancipatory, and different systems models and methods, we can make an informed choice of how we might go about addressing problem situations, navigating our way through them, seeking to improve them. And that critical awareness of the strengths and weaknesses of different systems approaches responds both to a theoretical critique, a social critique, and this again comes close to what some of the things that Klaus was saying. It wants to know where the ideas emerge from and who they serve, and also what impact they have back on society, very much a Wiener's notion of the human use of human beings. And an ecological critique, what do they add to the way that we treat the planet? And you can conduct on that basis, using a variety of systems, methodologies, models and methods, a multi-methodological intervention, seeking improvement across a set of criteria. Are we achieving efficiency, effectiveness? Are we improving mutual understanding? Are we making sure that those most disadvantaged have their situation improved and, as far as possible, are involved in the process? So this orientation, which has some similarities to the critical cybernetics as Klaus is trying to develop it, is pluralist. It's second order. It looks at the different systems approaches in terms of the distinctions that they make. It's socially aware, where it comes from in society, where the ideas originate from and the impact they have if you use them in society. It's modest. We can't understand the whole system. These are suggestions, and we can help some decision makers through the approaches that we use. We can help others to become better. It's a learning process. We won't know until we get involved in seeking to change systems which of the approaches gain traction and which bring benefits, understanding, learning, improvement. And it's an action research approach. And I think it relates, of all philosophies, back to pragmatism. And my bit of advertising, that's the book, Critical Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity, which sets out this particular version of the history of systems thinking, critical systems thinking and management of complexity, responsible leadership for a complex world, and that reviews the development of modern systems thinking, 10 systems methodologies, and the way that they differ in how they see complexity and how they seek to address it. So forgive me that bit of advertising, Jason, but I will finish at that point. Jason, you're muted.
I was just asking, do we have clarification questions, or should we continue to the next presentation?
One question for clarification. That is, do you intentionally and purposefully and completely exclude mathematics and logic from your viewpoint?
No, I'm not. There were developing from various aspects of systems thinking. Of course, people like George Clear were looking at issues of decomposition, and there were mathematical systems approaches. I haven't dealt with them in this presentation. I'm not particularly equipped to do so. I was concerned much more with the development of system thinking and cybernetics as it impacts social systems.
I would like to raise a point in relation to what you have been saying. Critical comes from the Greek krinein, as you know, and it is about making a distinction. So what is critical about critical cybernetics and critical systems theory would be that the systems are not out there, but they're made by the distinctions.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Yes, and I'm trying to look at the distinctions that are made by the different systems approaches in the very broad brush description that I've just given. Hard systems approaches make different distinctions to soft systems approaches. Emancipatory systems approaches make different distinctions to hard and soft, and critical systems thinking is looking closely at those distinctions. And of course, you can become more specific by looking at, for example, the kind of distinctions that system dynamics draws or the viable system model draws.
John, you have
but
a
the
question for
Yes.
clarification?
Yes, thank you, Jason. Mike, you used the criteria of pragmatism in your presentation, and I thank you for that. Do you have any particular view or flavor of pragmatism that you have adopted for your analysis?
The critical systems thinking has been through a variety of attempts to find an underlying philosophy, if you like, which corresponds to its tenets. It's built itself upon principles of pluralism, of second order analysis of systems approaches, and of seeking to bring improvements. So you're looking for an underlying philosophy which embraces those three principles which it came to develop itself on. And people have suggested all kinds of different things. I thought Habermas at one stage, and then of course you get the postmodern critiques of Habermas. Other people such as John Mingus have looked at critical realism. I've struggled with that because I think if you have a philosophy which uses other philosophies for its own purposes, then you can't be pluralistic, if you like. This one philosophy that you're privileging, through which you look at all the others, becomes an imperialistic vehicle and distorts other ways of looking at things. So what is the most open philosophy? And recently, it's relatively recently that people have started looking to pragmatism as a form of underpinning for critical systems thinking. And of course, I don't mean here the everyday meaning of pragmatism of what works. I do mean the pragmatism going back to Peirce and my understanding of the way that natural science operates would be a Peircean understanding, that we're not actually, although there's argument about what Peirce meant, but ultimately depends upon a consensus among those involved in the scientific community. And then we have a truth which exists for a certain period of time until it's challenged. And then you get sort of James type psychological pragmatism. Perhaps Dewey's work is, but I need to do more work on it. Perhaps Dewey's work is the most relevant, where you can bring theories to the fore in the way that critical systems thinking does, and work with them, and you can still do theoretical work. It's not a theoretical pragmatism in any sense, but it's more about the community there is extended to obviously to all the stakeholders in society in Dewey. So it's a broader conception which is more relevant to social systems than is the case in Peirce. And also Rorty's work is interesting, but I'll just leave it at that, John.
All right.
Well,
have you taken any thought to looking at Rorty or Davidson or the neo-pragmatists?
I have read The Mirror of Nature, and of course there's a lot of debate about Rorty. He goes, look, I'll speak in a very basic common sense form. He goes too far for me in terms of natural science.
All right, thanks.
But I understand the point in terms of the social sciences.